Good morning and welcome online, Jasper County Jail, DeMont, Wheatfield, and Hebron. Today's the day. You picked a good day to be in church. I hope you guys had a good weekend. I had a nice day off, my off day Saturday, and we went to Costco, which I haven't been to in years. And I forgot it was Super Bowl Sunday, which means that Costco, we had literal gridlock. I've never experienced that of shopping carts. Like you're just stuck in an aisle, like nobody's moving because there's so many people trying to buy diabetes food is what I call it. But I didn't even know such delicious things exist. You walk by it, it's like, oh, that looks good and that looks good. I didn't know that they had Reese's animal crackers. That looks so good. It's a terrible decision, but it's diabetes in a bag, which I already have, by the way, so it was like, whatever. Anyway, I hope you had a great weekend. We are in the final week of our series, Actions Speak Louder Than Words. And in week 1, we talked about Jesus' radical plan for reactions. He calls us to react differently. And if you remember in the Sermon on the Mount, he says in Matthew 5 and verse 43, you've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's a tough passage, isn't it? I mean, you read that and you're like, I don't know if I can do that. Now, I want to be clear. He's not saying let evil win. Sometimes loving your enemies means stopping them from being evil, sometimes with force. What he's calling us to do is to not dehumanize people in our hearts. He's calling us to practice the discipline of forgiveness and to not hate others. And I gave you 3 simple steps to practicing this. Step 1 was surround yourself with the things of God. Step 2 was pause and ask, what would Jesus do before you react? And then number 3 was make it right when you mess up. Make it right when you mess up. And I said, 25% of the battle with those 3 steps. Last week was 75% of the battle. We looked at the question, how do I react the way that Jesus calls me to when I don't feel like it? There's a lot of us, we just don't feel, it's like, Jesus, I really don't want to love that person. I don't feel, and the answer to that question is to remember God's holiness. We've been spending 30 seconds each morning reflecting on the glory of God. We've been reading Ezekiel 1, 26 through 28. I gave that to you on that blue sheet of paper. And it really is life-changing to remember the incredible God outside of and beyond the space and time of our universe. It makes a lot of petty things go away, doesn't it? It humbles us just to think about, wow, like God is amazing and holy. I hope you've enjoyed that this week. And just think about Ezekiel and Isaiah. Whenever they see God, they just fall to their faces fearing imminent death. And here's the kicker. I only alluded to it last week, but that amazing God, whose very nature can obliterate sin, that God looks at you and he gives you grace. And grace is this important concept that I think a lot of us don't really understand, but it's the keystone to reactions speaking louder than our words. Grace is what cements the bricks that we built the last couple weeks into place. If you want to react like Christ for the long term, if you want to live this godly life with godly reactions, you have to understand grace. And what I want to do today, this is a very classic Pastor John message. I want to tell a story, look at some Bible, and make some points, okay? And I've got 4 points instead of 3, which is a little atypical, but you guys can handle it. But my story today, that I want to tell, is one that I've told many times before. I think the last time was March of 23, and so some of you guys are like, well, I've heard this already. But really, it was kind of a big deal in my life. It was kind of a turning point, so I'm going to tell the story. It'll all make sense, and it's the only story like this one that I have, so I have to use it. But a little over 11 years ago, I started getting these pounding headaches, the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. I've had kidney stones. I've had a lot of different pain. This is the worst pain I've ever had. I mean, it felt like my head was getting ripped open, and I go to the doctor, and they said, well, because of the severity of your headaches, we want to give you a CAT scan. And so, like, my wife was very pregnant, and the CAT scan ended up being on the day that she was due with our second-born daughter. And when I left, she was having contractions. But I said, look, I know you're in pain, but I'm in pain. What I need you to do is just hold it, okay? I'll be back. So I go, and, they're getting ready to put me in the tube. If you ever had, CAT, they put you in the tube thing, and you got to leave all your stuff with them. And so I leave my phone with them, and I said, hey, look, Mr. Technician, sir, if you see a call on my phone from my wife, you got to tell me because she is due today and she was having contractions when I left. And he goes, all right, what's your wife's name? And I said, well, on my phone, it's Crunchwrap Supreme because that was my nickname for her at the time. Well, I love Taco Bell and I love my wife, right? So it's kind of like, of course, it makes sense. Like Crunchwrap Supreme is delicious and so is she. She's my Crunchwrap, Anyway, so then I tell him, I say, hey, you're going to let me see my brain, right? And he looks at me, and this is what he does. He says, my man, right? And he fist bumped me. Well, that means you're going to let me see my brain, right? Obviously, my man, see my brain, right? So he scans my brain, and while I'm in the tube, they have like a radio. They can talk to you while you're in the tube. And he's like, what side did you say your brain hurt? And I was like, bro, right side of my brain. Like, don't you have it in your notes? He's like, all right. And I can hear some shaking in his voice. And I get out of the tube, gives me all my stuff back. And he looks at me like he's seeing a ghost. Like I can tell he is pale, like clearly, like sweaty, clammy. It's not good. He's really nervous. And he looks at me, he goes, when did you say your baby was due? It's like, bruh, today. Like we had this conversation, crunch wrap, remember? Let me see my brain. He's like, nah, I better not. And I can just tell he's so nervous. I was like, why not? He goes, questions and stuff. A doctor will call you shortly. And they did. They called me on the way home. They were very concerned. And ultimately, this is what they showed me. Put up that, right there. That is my brain, okay? It looks like this is like a bad view. Like, this is your brain on drugs. Except I was totally sober. This is just, it's my brain. And that's bad. And I got home that night, and my wife just cried. She was super upset. I wasn't that concerned. I always say this because she'd be a rich woman, and she can pick out a date and a dress for my funeral. She'll be fine, right? But she was nervous because she had, an infant, or she was about to have an infant, and a 2-year-old. She was living in my parents' basement because I'm like an awesome provider. She was living in my parents' basement with me, okay? But I felt powerless. It's like the first time in my life. Have you ever felt powerless? I've been able to control most things in my life. Right? I mean, I've been able to, weave and do whatever I need to do to get stuff done. And in this moment, like there was something I had no control over. In a sense, I felt like Isaiah and Ezekiel when they saw God. It was just like, woe is me. I'm going to die. I was 27 years old. And for the first time in my life, I didn't think I might. Like I knew for sure I was a dead man. I was going to die. I saw that. They were concerned. And maybe you never had a moment like that, but I have. And I can't explain it other than like it was terrifying. I knew I was going to die. And I was flipping burgers on the grill that night. And at the time, I had what I thought was a good job. Felt like a pretty good job. I was the executive pastor of a large church, which means I ran the business stuff and the staff, and I was good at it. I enjoyed what I did. It was safe. But I remember flipping burgers and feeling just the deepest sense of regret because I wanted to be a senior pastor. I wanted to preach. I knew I had a gift of preaching, and I just felt called by God to preach so people could know Jesus. And I'd never gotten to do it in my life. I never really used it. Felt like a racehorse who never got to run a race. And it was just, I can't tell you the grief that I felt about that. And obviously, missing my kids growing up and whatever, and I knew they'd be fine. I wanted to do this thing. And it seemed like even if I did live, I'd have a traumatic brain injury, obviously, operating on this big giant hole right here. It's like, what are you going to do? My brother, by the way, saw that, and he goes, no wonder you're the dumbest one in the family. And I was like, that's exactly how you comfort your brother. I'm glad he brought me back down to earth. But I just felt so powerless. And I remember I was flipping burgers, and I told God in that moment, I said, if you let me live, I promise I'm going to be a senior pastor. Like I will. I'm going to lead. I promise I will do it. But I thought my life was over. Within a few days, I met with a neurologist, and I'm in the exam room, and his assistant's having me touch my nose and walk in a line, and he's looking at me flabbergasted, and the neurologist pulls me out of the exam room into his office. And I figured that's what you do when you got to give a patient really bad news. Now, this neurologist, I did not know this, but apparently some doctors have big shot offices. This guy had a library full of rich mahogany and leather-bound books. I mean, he was like the anchor man. It was just ridiculous, And I go in his huge office, and he shows me the pictures, and he's like, John, I've been in this for 20 years. That's the biggest hole in a brain I've ever seen. And I was like, nice, I'm first place at something. First place at hole in your brain. But he said, look, we can't do anything about it. It's concerning to me. But I'm almost certain you've had it from birth, because if that developed now, you would not be walking and talking. He goes, honestly, in light of its scope, I can't even believe that you can function. And give me a wide shot again, okay? See, he was concerned about this line. He said, like, there's a bubble out into some kind of line in the center of your brain, but here you are. And he goes, if we treat you, it's going to make it worse. I think the best thing we can do is monitor it. And then he said these words, and this was like the best thing I've ever heard in my life. He goes, honestly, if you've been okay this long, you're probably still going to be okay. Right? The headaches you felt were probably unrelated. It was probably just, he called it fluid, I call it juices inside of the hole in your brain were probably infected or whatever, but you're fine. And I used to get it measured every few years, but every time you get an MRI, it's like $1,500. So I said, we're done with that. Because what are they going to do? They're going to say, well, you're dying, whatever. So I stopped doing it, and I'm just sending it. I'm just going to send it with my brain. But anyway, I want to talk about my reaction to that moment of grace, because that's what it was. It was a grace in my life. I was facing an imminent outcome. It was unavoidable. And the doctor said, you'll probably be fine. And I can't tell you, you hear that, and it's just like, the relief. And the grace, that's what it is it's a pardon from a negative outcome, a consequence, or a punishment. It's a pardon. That's what grace is. I thought I was going to die. I fell on my face just thinking, woe is me, I'm going to die soon, it's inevitable. I knew it was done. And then I got grace from that imminent outcome. It was a pardon, and honestly, it changed my life. I thought all these things that I wanted to do, I wasn't going to get to do. I realized I had no control over anything. I mean, this was an uncontrollable thing. I was grieving those things, and then I found out that maybe I could do those things after all. And I attacked living life like never before. I enjoyed each day more than I ever had. And what I really had, this is a big deal, was gratitude. Because grace creates gratitude when received correctly. And this is a big deal about grace. When you really receive grace correctly, you are going to be grateful. That week, immediately, I went to my boss and pastor, and I told him, and he'd been trying to talk me into working for him. He liked having me as his executive pastor, and I was good at it. He told me, you're not cut out to be a senior pastor. This is what you should do. But I told him, I said, hey, I saw what the end of my life would feel like if I didn't live out this calling. I need to do it. I don't want to feel that regret ever again. And a year later, I was the pastor of this church. That's how it worked out. That was my reaction to grace. I stopped taking for granted the life that I had, and I lived every moment to the fullest, knowing that each second was a gift. I had a second chance at life. I lived with thankfulness and gratitude. I found salvation from this death, and so I lived with grateful service in my life. And that's what happened from that grace. That's what grace did for me, and that's what grace produces in anybody who receives it properly. But sometimes people don't receive grace properly. Imagine with me for a moment if I went through all of that, and then I was unchanged. I mean, imagine, you have this experience, you do this stuff, and then I just keep living life same old, like nothing ever happened. Can you imagine how ridiculous that would be? And yet, I believe that sometimes this happens for some people. And it's something that Jesus was really passionate about teaching on. He knew that there would be people who would receive grace from God, but it wouldn't change their life. And he devotes and allocates this huge amount of his teaching in Matthew chapter 18 to talking about this specific issue. When you receive the grace of God, but it doesn't change your life. Now, Jesus had these 12 followers, these 12 students. They're called the 12 disciples. 10 of them were probably teenagers, mid-teenagers, like 15, 16 years old, and they bicker with each other. That Matthew chapter 5 passage that we did week 1 on, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that passage was part of this speech called the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave over and over again. It was his stump speech. He'd go from village to village teaching this. So they heard Jesus say this over and over and over again, but his disciples weren't getting it. When you read the biographies of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when you read those 4 biographies of Jesus' life, you'll see over time the disciples are bickering with each other more and more. Any of you guys have kids, siblings? You just bicker with each other all the time, and Jesus is just getting more and more irritated. He's like, guys, will you stop it? Will you stop bickering? I mean, come on. And in Luke chapter 9, they get to this village, and the village is supposed to receive them and host them, but they don't. And the disciples look at Jesus, and they say, hey, do you want us to call down fire on the village and kill everybody in it? Every man, woman, and child. And Jesus is like, are you kidding me, fellas? Come on. Are you even listening to a word that's coming out of my mouth? Like, I've said this over and over again. You ever been that way with your kids? It's like, you guys don't get it. I mean, you really don't get it. How thick are you? So the disciples, they hear Jesus teaching on this over and over again. And eventually, Peter comes to Jesus, and he's finally starting to get it in Matthew 18. And he says, Jesus, so how many times do we need to forgive like an enemy? Like how many, what's the amount? In their culture, forgiving without payback once was a big deal. It was all about vengeance in almost all of human history. I mean, that's it. Jesus is the only reason unmerited forgiveness and grace even exists as a thing in the human experience. But their society is a lot like liberal society today. Liberal society is a perfect example of antiquity. If you screw up one time, you're out, you're canceled, you're evil, you're terrible, you're unforgivable. That was the world in that day. And Jesus sees this opportunity to make his big point to them, and it's super powerful. Jesus clearly teaches us why grace does not work for some people. Check out the conversation in Matthew 18, verse 21. It says, then Peter came to Jesus and said, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? 7 was the number of perfection, and it was a pretty high number in their minds. I mean, imagine forgiving someone who betrays you, who cheats on you, 7 times. It's a lot. And Jesus goes, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. For those of you who can't do math because you have a hole in your brains, it's 490. But I had to use a calculator because I have a hole in my brain. Abacus. Just kidding. No. That's a lot. I want to talk about why Jesus says that number, though, because really he's not saying 490. He's saying infinity times. You never stop forgiving. It doesn't mean enabling somebody. It doesn't mean being a codependent. But he's talking about releasing that a bitterness in our heart. And he tells us exactly how we can do this. The key is grace. Letting you in, spoiler alert, the key is grace. But he tells us how this works. And this teaching I'm about to give to you, starting at verse 23 in chapter 18, is so, so powerful. This will change your life. If you deal with unforgiveness, I mean, this is going to really transform the way that you look at grace and the way you look at people in your life. I think this is one of my favorite things. If you bicker with your spouse a lot, you're going to want to look at this passage. I love this. It's so good. 23 says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who would borrow money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought to him who owed him millions of dollars. I want you to remember that number because millions of dollars, that's a lot. That's technically over $1 million. So it's a lot of money. You know, it's a lot, but it's a lot of money. He couldn't pay. So his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, children, and everything he owned to pay the debt. Now, slavery was practiced by every tongue, tribe, and nation in human history, still practiced in many non-Christian countries around the world. The only reason slavery is considered not okay is because of the teachings of Jesus, specifically in passages like this, which is remarkable. He orders him to be sold. But the man fell down before his master and he begged, please be patient with me and I'll pay it all. Now, this is unheard of. No king would forgive somebody for millions. I mean, this is ridiculous. Who's going to do that? Then his master was filled with pity for him, and he released him and forgave the debt. He didn't say, I'll give you more time. He said, you know what, I'm going to do one more for you. I'm just going to forgive you and wipe away millions of dollars. And everybody knows this is what our relationship with God is like. That's grace. We see God on his glorious throne in heaven. Our lives on earth might be radiant, but compared to the God made of glory and fire and lava and gemstones in heaven, we fall short. We couldn't be with God in heaven, so God had mercy on us. It's a big deal. Now, imagine this next part with me. This is good. This is where he gets them, all the disciples. And it's just Jesus and his 12 disciples that he's teaching this to. This isn't like a big public room. They're just teaching, little small group, little life group. Verse 28, it says, but when the man left the king, okay, right after he leaves the king says, you're forgiven, tears, oh my goodness, you know, God's so good, he pardoned me, whatever. He went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and he demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Please be patient with me and I'll pay it, he pleaded. But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. Now the hypocrisy here is shocking. It's like, are you serious? I mean, everybody's like, oh, but here's the thing. All the disciples knew that Jesus was teaching at them. They all knew. They were fighting each other. I mean, it's almost awkward because Jesus is saying, you're the ungrateful servants. This is you. They receive grace from God, but they're throwing each other into debtors' prisons. It's awkward. I mean, Jesus just turns the table. He's got them all by the short hairs, the back of their neck. Have you ever been in that situation? You know, you're sitting there and you can hear the clock ticking and your parents are lecturing you because you got busted, you know, toilet papering or doing whatever it is that you did. And you're just like, I'm a dead man, right? And you see this and your parents have you and you knew you were wrong and they knew you were wrong. That's a situation. It's quiet. And then Jesus gets to the most powerful part. Verse 33, I mean, this is convicting. This should change your life. Jesus adds this part. Some of the people who saw this ungrateful servant do this hypocritical act, they go to the king and they say, dude, this guy is ridiculous. You need to get him. So the king goes and he finds him. In verse 33, he says, this is the king speaking, shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be, and these are Jesus' words here, tortured until he had paid his entire debt. And then verse 35, Matthew chapter 18, verse 35. This should pierce all our hearts. This is the wake-up call for all of us, okay? That's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your hearts. Okay, I put this up actually on my wall every time I'm talking with my kids when they've been fighting with them. I want you guys to see. No, just kidding, I don't, but guys, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, this all the disciples, their jaws are on the floor. Just, are you serious, Jesus? It's a pretty serious set of words, but Jesus makes it so clear. If you don't forgive others, your heavenly Father will not forgive you. It's a big deal. The servant of the king that was ungrateful is like a Christian who struggles to forgive. And Jesus is like, this is a problem. Grace should transform your life. The big question, and this is the big question, many of you are asking it, is why did he struggle to react to the grace? Like, what didn't work? Why did the grace? God gave him grace, the king gave him grace, but somehow it did not reach his heart. What kept the grace from reaching his heart? And that's what I want to spend the rest of this message looking at. I'm going to talk about reacting with forgiveness. And I think there are 4 reasons the grace of God will not make it to our hearts. And these are big. You're going to want to lean into this. This really matters. There are 4 reasons. Number 1, I think the servant may not have actually believed that he needed the grace. And this is the most common reason. This is the most common reason that I see that people miss out on the benefits of grace. You know, if I'd have never recognized how serious the hole in my brain was, okay, if I was like, it's no big deal, everybody's got a hole in their brain, you know what I mean? Come on, guys. It wouldn't have mattered if I found out that I was going to live, because I always thought I was going to live. Wouldn't have mattered. Wouldn't have been an act of grace. It would have just been a meh. And I think the servant may have made this mistake. We all have these really powerful rationalizing machines in our heads, don't we? I mean, we can turn, what do you think he said? He probably said, well, it's not my fault the debts came in. You know, the market got me. It was market timing. Anybody would have failed in my position. I mean, the king, really, he put unfair expectations on me. He's rich anyway. Just tax the rich, right? That's what, just tax the rich. Who cares? You know, it doesn't even, I'm really actually a good person. I mean, it was just one little screw up, the totality of my life. The good outweighs the bad. The king had to see that. It wasn't really an act of grace. It's really what he owed me. That's what we all sound like, isn't it? When we receive grace from somebody. I'm actually a good person. Sure, I've got some screw-ups, but I'm really a good person. Really, it wasn't my fault. Isn't it amazing how we can do that with the biggest acts of grace? You know, I really had to. I mean, she kind of made me do it, you know, whatever. And I think this is the biggest thought that undermines the work of the grace of God in our life. We don't think we're really all that sinful. I'm a good person. My kids really should be more grateful because I've been a good person. I mean, they don't know how hard and, you know, people should appreciate me more because I'm really kind of great. Nobody appreciates me. And those are the fertile ground for overreactions and narcissism in our heart. Those thoughts are. And I just think there's so many people, I mean, great marriages, great relationships, great lives are destroyed by these thoughts. I don't really need God. I'm really a good person. We might be good compared to other people, but compared to the glory of God who's worshiped by mighty angels in heaven, that God is much better than we are. And we need grace to have a relationship with that God. And, you know, I think there's a lot of people, and this is sad, but I think there's a lot of people who see God as almost equal to us. Right? Here's me, here's God. I mean, he's better than me, but the chasm, you know, I mean, I'm a pretty good person. And that is a heretical view of God. That is a view of God that will destroy your relationship with God. I mean, God's, you know, he's great. I mean, Jesus, you know, he was good. I mean, he was good. I mean, I'm pretty good, but God's pretty good. Do you believe that compared to God, you're not just a little bad, but you're sinful, and the biblical word is depraved. Totally depravity. I mean, I fall completely, desperately short of God's glorious standard. Do you believe that you need grace and mercy? If you're going to have a relationship with God, you have to believe that you fall completely short of God's radiant, glorious standard. That's why we're meditating on the glory of God this whole last week. If you don't believe that, the grace of God will not take effect in your life. It'll just be like, no big deal. The second reason that we undervalue, or that the grace doesn't work in our life is because we undervalue it. I think a lot of people, we don't value it correctly. We underestimate its worth. I learned this lesson this last week. This last week, my wife had a stomach bug, as many of us have had. And for 14 years, my wife has made me lunch every workday. Always makes me lunch, puts a nice little note in it, you know, cute note. Sometimes there's drawings, cartoons with it. And it's nice. I've liked it, right? And this last week was the first time in 14 years I had to make a lunch. Now, lately I've just kind of come to expect it. But this week, I had to pack my own lunch, as well as lunch for my kids and a friend we make lunches for. And by we, I mean she makes lunches for. But that's 6 lunches. And to be honest with you, I didn't really have to do much of it because she made most of it, and then she started to pass out, which I was like, you know, you could have finished. I mean, you were that close. You know, you could have just put your head between your legs and just keep going. I mean, come on, what's the big deal, right? So I had to do it, and you guys, it was a lot of work. I mean, I just couldn't manage, you know, this one gets this one gets 2 salamis, this one has cheese, this one doesn't have cheese. I mean, oh my goodness, why do we spoil our kids? Just eat it, you know what I mean? But I had to take care of them and whatever, and Mommy does it this way, and I was like, well, Dad doesn't, okay? Everybody was upset. It was hard. And I realized for years, I've been undervaluing the grace of God in my life, or the grace of my wife in my life. The servant in Jesus' story gets millions forgiven by the king. But when a servant who owes him a few thousand doesn't pay, he loses his mind because I think there's a good chance. He just underestimated the value. He thought, what's a few million to a billionaire? Undervaluing a gift of grace in your life. It hurts you the most. Right away, it just does. When you undervalue a gift, you enjoy it less. I would suggest in life, overestimate the value of gifts that you get. You're going to live a better life. You'll be happier. Who cares about the giver? You will be happier if you And listen, it's impossible to overestimate the value of the gift that God gave us. God, the creator of the universe, came into the very world that he created, died for you, descended into hell itself for you. That's a big gift. Don't undervalue that gift of grace. The third reason I think God's grace doesn't take effect in our life is I think there's a lot of us, we don't really believe that God would really give us grace. And this is actually the one that I think the ungrateful servant failed at. Okay, the other ones, hypothetically, you can see it, but this is really, I think what happened was he begged the king, please give me more time. And the king says, no, I won't give you more time. I'll erase the whole debt. But in his mind, sometimes I wonder if he was like, well, I'm going to pay him back. I don't really need the grace. I mean, I'll pay him back. I'll pay him back. I'll pay him back. You ever thought that? You know, you receive forgiveness, you receive grace, but you're like, no, I'll pay you back. I will. And in his mind, he leaves, and what does he do? He sees somebody, he's like, I gotta pay back the king. Never mind that the king forgave me, I gotta pay back the king. So he grabs the guy by the throat because he's like, I was just humiliated. And what is really at the base of all this? It's pride. It's pride, isn't it? He grabs the guy, he says, you owe me, and this is super common among Christians. And the result of this, it's always legalism, isn't it? You meet these Pharisaical, legalistic people, and they're like, the only people who go to Christian school are ones who do all these things in Heidelberg and Belgic and whatever, and we're going to purge it and make sure this community, and you can't come to our church unless you're perfect and whatever, and you got to follow all these rules and whatever. And listen, we're saved by grace through faith in Christ alone. That's it. But we forget that. We forget that God can really forgive us. Or, you ever met somebody who feels like they're unforgivable also? It's not just that God will give you, they're like, well, God gave everyone else grace, but me, I'm too bad. And what does that do when you feel unforgivable is you become a shut down person emotionally who is like angry at everyone in your heart. You just kind of push everybody out of your life because deep down you hate yourself. You're constantly angry at everyone, including yourself most of all. And this type of person, you end up lost in your head all the time. Like this type of person, when you don't think you can receive God's grace, you're constantly everything. You're evaluating and you're always lost in your thoughts. Did they really mean this? What did they mean by that? Whatever. You're overthinking things all the time. And if this is you, here's what I have to say to you is, I've had 4 preschoolers in my life. And what I've learned about preschoolers is some of them are really good at art and some are really bad at art. You know what I mean? Some are good, some are bad. And you get one and you're like, wow, that's not bad for a preschooler. And then one, it's like, wow, are you okay? Maybe we should get you tested. You know what I mean? Maybe we need to get you, like, wow, big difference, right? No. Listen, the gap that separates the best from the worst is far smaller than the gap that separates the best from Rembrandt, from Da Vinci, from Michelangelo. There's a big, the true masters, you take the best preschooler, it's like, wow, there's the best and the worst. Wow, it's pretty good for a preschooler. But then you compare them to Rembrandt, it's like, whoa, Picasso. It's like, wow, Picasso. I never got him, but anyway, we'll leave him out, okay? To Michelangelo, it's like, wow, oh my goodness, right? Here's the thing. The gap that separates the best Christian from the worst Christian, probably pretty substantial. But the gap that separates the best Christian from the worst Christian is far smaller than the gap that separates all of us from God as a group. Right? If God was, but when you really understand, wow, like God overcomes this huge chasm of depravity to reach out to us. We're no longer comparing ourselves to other people. That's the thing about grace. Nobody deserves it. Nobody's earned it. God looks at each of us without one plea, just as we are, and he offers us grace. And you're not too far gone to receive it. And that's why we say no one's perfect and everyone's welcome at this church. Because we understand that God's grace is available to all who would receive it. The final reason, I think the servant may have yelled at his friend, and this is the one I struggle with, and this is the one that convicted me, is I think he forgot about it. I think there's a lot of us, we receive God's grace at one point in our life, and we kind of just forget about it. 11 years ago, I received an act of grace from God in my life, and it's amazing how God can use a bad thing and turn it into a good thing. That's grace. The longer I've followed God, the more I've realized that sometimes the very things that I try to pray away end up being used by God to be the biggest blessing in my life. The more I followed God, the more I've realized that he does this. He's redeemed what the devil wanted to use for evil, and he's used it for my good. He specializes, the Bible says, in using the weak things to shame the strong. Paul says, I rejoice. And this is interesting. Paul, who's faced a lot of things, like a lot of hard things, says, I rejoice in weaknesses, in persecution, in insult, and in slander. For in these things, God's power is made perfect in me, in my weaknesses. And it's like you hear that and like, I didn't get that and it didn't make sense, but then I had a cyst in my brain, a hole in my head, and I saw how God used it as a grace in my life, one of the most powerful moments in my life. God has used that for so much good in my life. It transformed my life for the better in a big way. And that's what God does. He can use an empty womb. He can use a broken heart. He can use a painful loss, an empty spot at the dinner table, any kind of setback as a setup for a whole nother level. And I want to be clear, for a few nights I thought I was going to die. Some medical people thought I was in big trouble. And I begged God for another shot at life. I knew I was called to it. I knew I was called to this thing in my life, and I had been procrastinating that call since I was 15. I knew that I was called by God to do this. It was a certainty deep in my heart. And when I thought I was dying and I knew that I'd missed it, I was heartbroken. And then God gave me grace, and I ran after it. And I want to be clear, it changed my life forever. For years, I made the most of the second shot at life that I was given. I usually work 60, but a lot of weeks I work 80 hours a week, 6 days a week. with people at our house many nights. Sometimes people look at the Hill family and they're like, well, how do you guys do it? We didn't always do it that way. You know what changed us was the grace of God in our lives. It was grace. It was by grace. God changed us. He motivated us. I mean, everything transformed in that moment. I sat down with my wife. I said, God has given us this shot. We are going to live with intensity every moment. We weren't always that way. I wasn't always this intense, believe it or not. But I was going to die, and now I'm going to live. So I worked with passion on messages. I led building campaigns, prayed with angst over people needing God. I mean, every opportunity to reach somebody. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. God gave this to me. It's a gift from God. Each day is a gift because in my mind's eye, I had seen God and I knew He had more for me to do in this life, and each opportunity to do it was a gift of grace. When I had that second chance at life, I mean, I have roared at it for years, for about 9 years to be exact. But sometime in the last year or two, things started changing. You know, I mean, the thought of another campus, the thought of another service, the thought of reaching another community, which had been the cry of my heart, just sort of lost its color. It's like, really? My reaction to God's grace in my life just started waning because I think I just got used to it. You know, I just got used to it. It lasted for years, but this week as I was writing this message, I was really reflecting on my reactions and thinking about my reactions to God's grace in my heart, and I just realized it's not the same as it was. It's not the same. I'm not reacting the way. I'm getting offended more easily. I mean, all these things. I thought, why is that happening? I don't think I undervalue it. I believe that I don't deserve it, but by grace I've been saved. I mean, I believe that stuff, but I just wonder if I've forgotten, if it's fading. And I wonder that for a lot of us. If we've forgotten what it was like to gather for a Sunday night service and have only 8 or 10 of us show up, praying and crying that God would save our church or reach our children or build a community that could reach the next generation. I wonder if we've forgotten what it was like to gather on Sunday morning and have our entire kids ministry be comprised of 10 or 15 kids thinking, Lord, what's happening? Where did they go? What are we going to do? I wonder if we've forgotten what it was like to live with the burden of recognizing that a church that was over 100 years old was going to die on our watch as we begged God to save it and to save our families. I wonder if we've just forgotten. I sit in the lobbies now and watch people streaming through our doors, which is a true gift of God's grace in our lives. We watched Him do it, a great restorative work in our communities and in our hearts. And we just think, meh, that's great. This is a gift. This life is a gift. In the expanse of the cosmos, God made you, created you, called you for a purpose, redeemed you, and has given you this life. It's a gift. And so many of us, we just wake up and today I want you to imagine finding out that you're going to die in 2 weeks. I want you to imagine, you go to the doctor and you find out, that's it, I got 2 weeks. What in your life are you sad God has called you to do that you have not done? It's the greatest gift of grace I've ever received is to have an opportunity to feel that pain, to feel that remorse, and then have a shot at living it out. I never want to feel that way again. If I found out I was dying, look, I'm ready to meet God because of the covering of grace I've received from Jesus. But I'm also heartbroken because I recognize that once again, I have stopped striving for the calling God has put in my heart. I look at 2 campuses and that's great, but ever since I've gotten here, I believe God's called us to 6. Let's do it. Let's do more. Why am I sitting here just relaxing when God has called me to more? If you were going to show God the treasure of your life in heaven one day, do you have regrets? If you found out this was it, do you have regrets? Listen, this is a gift from God. Tomorrow is not a guarantee. Today is a gift from God. Let's maximize it. Let's live for God's glory. For by grace, we've been saved through faith. And our reactions to that grace, man, they changed the world. There's a reaction to the grace of God that has set slaves free. It's reaction to the grace of God that have ended endless wars. It's reaction to the grace of God that has brought about the Industrial Revolution, the scientific method, created orphanages, hospitals, modern medicine. It is reaction to the grace of God that has caused Christians to lead in all these different areas because Christians uniquely among all humans believe that life is a gift. And I want us to continue to react to God's grace in a way that really reflects what it is. It's the grace of God. As we close, I want to ask you to stand to your feet. What is the vision that God placed on your heart and your life that you're not living? Today, I want men and women to look at their families, and I want us to allow God's grace to fall afresh on us, and I want us to walk towards that vision once more. I want fathers and mothers to call their children to God's great purposes for our lives, making disciples of all the nations. I want us to live with purpose and intensity again in the expanse of the cosmos across billions of universes. trillions of stars. We sit here catapulting around the sun. How many more years, how many more laps around the sun do we have? I don't know, but I want us to live and react in a way that honors God and honors the gift of this life. As we close, let's pray. God, today I ask that your Spirit would fall afresh on us, that your glory would humble us, Lord, that we would reach the nations, not just because we love people, Lord, but because we love you, because your glory is worth it. And God, we just thank you for the gift of life. We're humbled by it. God, I ask that because of your word, because of your grace, we would live lives on purpose every day with intensity, with focus. This life is a gift. We thank you for your grace. We thank you that there's so much more to life than boats and snowmobiles and cabins and remodeling and whatever else, Lord, that we do. We thank you for an eternal purpose, your glory. And today we give this life to you and we resolve to live for you. We react to your grace with humble purpose and focus. In the name of Jesus, we pray all these things. Amen.